All right, so why are you here? I'm going to talk about advancing racial equity 4.0, right? So, in essence, in the only way that I can summarize this is helping people to take meaningful action without a hint of tokenism. So, this is kind of what all of this is about. One of the things that I say to everybody, irrespective of who you are, right? So whether you're running your own company, whether you're the CEO, whether you're the HR person, the DI lead, whether you're the HR consultant, even in context to the workplace, is what action have you taken so far specifically about racial equity? This is one of the things just to think about, because hopefully when I start going through the rest of the slides, this will help you maybe start to recalibrate what you have done. So I'm not here to say what's right or wrong. I'm here to give you the benefit of the insights that I have through the sheer amount of volume of work that I've done in this space. And the other thing I also want you to think about as I click through some of the slides is, if you do have a plan or you're doing some work specifically about racial equity, so this isn't about broader diversity and inclusion, if you had to think about on a scale of 1 to 10, like how confident are you with the plan that you have? How confident are you that it's credible? So these are kind of the two things that I would want you to hold in your mind. So let's rewind back to the summer of 2020, when it was the spark of what I call raising of social consciousness. This is what I call it, right? The collective social consciousness. And we've all known that racism is an issue, but I think seeing it in what I call stark high definition 4K in some instances play out, because we're all at home because of COVID-19, really brought into sharp relief that this is what I refer to as a stain on society's soul, because we've never, ever been able to solve this issue of racism. And not only have we never been able to solve it, we've also very rarely do we even talk about it. And the people that do talk about it and have historically spoken about it, advocated for it, been advocates, we've marginalized them or potentially called them militant. Now, in this space here is, up until the summer of 2020, I was one of the silent people. You know, I didn't, or very rarely did I speak about race. Very rarely did I speak about my experiences of racism. And like many people, you know, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, for me, the trigger was the video of Amy Cooper in Central Park. And it was just this jarring thing for me that said, I can no longer stay silent. I can no longer stay silent about my experience, and I can no longer stay silent about how deep an issue this is. Now, the 31st of May is the 1 year anniversary since I recorded my first video. And trust me when I tell you, I had no idea that me recording a video for 20 minutes in my bedroom was gonna just, you know, open up Pandora's box, so to speak, right? Just by definition of the fact there's so many nationalities and people from different countries on this call. I had no idea when I recorded that first video, you know, in my bedroom on my phone, right? And there are some things that we can all reflect on since the summer of 2020. But what I try to think about is, based on the conversations, the volume of conversations, insane amount of conversations, the messages, the mood in the room, so to speak, right? So what we're seeing in the media, what we're seeing other organizations talk about. And even now, with where we are almost a year later, one of the many things that are blocking organizations for making what I think truly credible and meaningful action in this space is the fear of saying and doing the wrong thing. Like, if I had £1 for every time I heard that, you know, like my mortgage would have been paid off many, many, many years ago. But there is still this deep discomfort about race. There's still this discomfort about talking about racism. And this is across the board. This has nothing to do with skin color. But what we're seeing now in a business setting, right, in a workplace setting, is the societal backlash against organizations which look and stay the same is increasing, you know. And I liken this from a visual point of view of, you know, like the About Us section on a website, when you see all the senior people, you know, there is a backlash when those senior people are majority white, but even more so that they're white men. And that is particularly important when I will talk a little bit about the importance of that dynamic in relation to racism. But there is just this general feel that we used to say quite casually. Do you remember those days when we used to say, oh, you know, organizations have to represent the communities they serve? What COVID-19 has showed us, that organizations have to represent the global community we are now all part of, because what felt very big has now become quite small. And lastly, we can't hide from racism. So I know there's a lot of people, there's a lot of CEOs out there, a lot of executive board members who are hoping this would be a passing fad, that, you know, that will all go. You know, it's awful what happened, you know, to George Floyd, and, you know, there's many, many examples, but it's all going to die down. And as we can see, there are so many things bubbling up to the surface that it's making it very, very difficult for organizations to stay quiet. Like, silence is not an option anymore. So before I get into there's two main models that I wanted to share as part of this. As I said, it's the first unveiling to the world. But I just wanted to give you a sense of where this came from. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like it's if I had to prove to you why I am credible to talk about this, why I have, you know, this self-appointed job that I gave myself in June, when I decided I was just going to carry on talking with the, you know, crazy amount of videos that I did. But when you see the numbers and the volume, that's a lot of insight that I have. It's a lot of insight that rewired have. So what we stand for as a company, so I think, you know, talk about the company bit for a minute, is all about equity, anti-racism, and kindness. You know, this is about evolving workplace cultures to not, so all this talk about inclusion, we can never have inclusion if we don't talk about one of the biggest barriers to inclusion, and that is how people are treated according to their skin color, and the difference in how they're treated according to their proximity to what I call whiteness. And whiteness is the nucleus point being white cisgendered men. So when we talk about racism, so often we're thinking about either behavior, or we're thinking about, you know, oh, it's, you know, it's about white people are bad, and, you know, she's racist, he's not racist, or he's racist and he's not racist. And because it's become so casual, like, oh, I'm not racist, and that's the conversation dead pretty much. What I always talk about is understand what white supremacy is then. So forget this label of racist or not racist. White supremacy is acknowledging the fact that we live in a racialized society that, through perpetuating of systems, of policies, of approaches, right, creates favorable outcomes to individuals who don't look like me. And the most favorable outcomes are white cisgendered men. Now, there's historical reasons for that, but I always want to start that off, because when we talk about racism, this is more than just individual. This is about whiteness as a social construct. So this is what we're dealing with when it comes to racism. This is what people struggle with, because that's when you start to get into the defensiveness of, you know, I'm not privileged, and, you know, I've had a hard life, and it's not my fault, I was born into this, I didn't create these systems, I didn't. But in the workplace, which is a manifestation of what happens in society, the very systems, the very ways we do things, the formal, the informal ways we do things, are perpetuating racism, because society continues to perpetuate racism. And so we are already living in cultures, we experience workplace cultures that unintentionally do perpetuate racism, because we've never intentionally stepped back and say, how can we deconstruct this, right? How can we look at this, even though we know time and time again, the system, in inverted commas, in the workplace as an example, keeps producing favorable outcomes for white people by default. And we can see that from data. We can see that from the visuals of websites when you look at the teams. You can see that in the makeup of organizations, even though they have very multicultural and multi-ethnic communities. London is a great example. Almost 50% of London is made up of ethnic minorities in inverted commas. Yet it is very common to step into head offices where you either very rarely see Black people, or Black people are always in frontline operational roles. That is a consequence of a systemized racist system, a racist process. So that's what we talk about when we talk about systemic racism. That's what we mean. Do you know what I mean? And it's institutional, because you hear that phrase as well, because it is baked into our legal system. It's baked into our education system. All of this talk about decolonizing and all of that stuff comes from a recognition that we are perpetuating certain ideology, and we're perpetuating that by not talking about it. So that's kind of like my broad context to this. So in terms of the numbers, right? So collectively, we've unlocked about 50,000 global conversations about race. You know, even me as an individual, I went from having 3,000 followers in June last year to 36,000 followers on LinkedIn. Now that ordinarily is not, everyone's like, oh, that's great, but it's important because of what I've consistently been talking about. So what that tells me is there are still people who are trying to lean in, who are trying to learn more, right? I've had over 2,000 messages and DMs across all the different social platforms that I am, LinkedIn being a major one, but emails, Twitter DMs, Instagram DMs, both on my personal and my company pages. As a team, we've looked over 1,000 Black Lives Matter statements, anti-racism commitments, published DEI reports. Individually, I've recorded over 131 videos, 100 of them consecutively, starting from the 31st of May. And then I've held 33 live conversations on racism, not moved, common theme here. And then we've supported and partnered with over 24 organizations in some way, shape or form to help them get started here. So this is the first model. So don't worry about trying to read it, because we're all going to be like, so I'm going to break these down for you. But before you get started into this, one of the things that I've recognized is so many companies have jumped into action because they wanted to be seen to do something. And what there hasn't been is a cognizance about where you are first. And where you are is determined by how you have historically treated issues of racism, racial discrimination, racial harassment, but also the racial literacy within your organization, which basically means how often do you talk about race? And the reason why that's important, because dependent on where you are and dependent on what your appetite for change is and what your definition of great looks like, every company is going to have a different perspective. Part of that is going to be down to the CEO, the board, the non-executive directors, the investors, right, key stakeholders. All is going to influence how your company is going to show up here. So this model that we created is just to help people think about before they lurch into anything. It's like, here's to think about, where is your company here? What level are you? What level is your culture? What level are your leaders? So they've got 4 levels. The first level, no one ever wants to be at the bottom, but unfortunately somebody has to be at the bottom in this context. And that's where your company will treat this issue of racism and racial equity as a compliance issue. That's purely about reputational risk. So it's about making sure that you can demonstrate, and this is about the tick box approach that we all talk about and nobody likes, but a lot of companies still do, tick, tick, tick. What do we do? How do we do this? So that's when you're starting getting into companies that talk about, well, we train our people in this. And when they talk about what they train them in, it's like unconscious bias training. So they bring somebody in, they've done it once, they do it every 2 years, they can tick a box and say, this is what we've done. Their actions around this is driven by policy statements, page 9 of the employee handbook or page 27 that nobody ever looks after. So it's all about paper and what's written down. And if you're in a culture that treats this as a compliance issue, not only is there going to be no proactivity in how you address this, it's likely that you or your board are quite risk averse. Do you know what I mean? So you're probably not 100% sold on the true power of inclusion, of equity, of difference, coming together. This is what a level 1 organization looks like. And level 2 is where there's an intent to be inclusive. However, this intent is driven mainly by HR. So it seems to be a HR thing. HR are probably the department, or if you're the one individual, right, who's talking about this the most. And potentially there's like radio silence from the board, or maybe one or two people pipe up during what I call annual statement time. Results from your engagement survey, in response to poll surveys, or because you've got to publish your latest report or whatever it is. So it's driven by still process, and HR are seen to be custodians of that rather than the board. There's likely to be no overarching strategy here. Particularly, remember, I'm talking about racial equity in particular. And even as a level 2 organization, even with an intent to be inclusive, the language around this is still very generic. So it will feel very nice. So you will hear often talk about inclusion and belonging. You will still refer to as Black colleagues, as ethnic minorities, or BAME. That language is still used prolifically within the organization, even under the banner of being inclusive. Level 3 is where we start to get into a little bit more tangible stuff here. So here there is strategic focus and specific commitment. And what's different here is that the agenda, the racial equity agenda, the need to be anti-racist, is driven and owned by the board. So here you're likely to have a CEO who has been quite vocal, even if it's just internally. And they've said, this is how I want us to show up. This is what I want us to commit to. And even when they're talking about this, there's a lot of I statements rather than we, if you're a level 3 organization. There is some intent for proactivity, both in terms of communication and action here. The language is specific because they're now starting to specifically reference their Black colleagues. Not ethnic minorities, not BAME, not people of colour, Black colleagues. However, whilst they're still getting into rhythms and routines and what does communicating this look like, there is possibly a plan. They might not be 100% confident of the plan, but they're still kind of struggling with how much do they communicate externally. So what does that external narrative look like? They haven't quite nailed that yet, but they are committed, they're very specific, and they've made it a strategic focus. And then level 4, now technically, level 4 is not always the holy grail, right? Because not every organization wants to be here, because it means there has to be public and private accountability. This push for advancing racial equity is a business-led strategy. It is seen as a strategic imperative, and it is treated as such. There is specific language about race and racial equity and racism, right? There is a commitment to inclusion and to incorporate all of these different aspects. So you can bring in all the other communities that also need to be uplifted and welcomed into the organization. But they also apply pressure to their ecosystem. So think suppliers and partnerships. And that's more than just saying, what's your statement and what's your approach to this? They may apply positive pressure and say, well, for you to be partners with us, we need to see what you're doing in this area. What is your plan? What is your plan for gender representation? What is your plan for Black representation? Or, they're getting into specifics, and they're potentially voting with their budget about who they do business with. And there is frequent and authentic communication here, both internally and externally. So these organizations are likely to have to communicate to shareholders, external stakeholders. So there is an expectation that they have to do this. What makes them level 4? Because just by communicating externally doesn't make you level 4. It's authentic. So this isn't about the glossy, D&I report with, the Black faces on the front cover and all the rest of it. This is an acknowledgement that this is going to take work, that this is not going to happen by the end of Q1 in the next 2 years, that this is beyond a 2 to 5 year strategy plan. but there's a plan, it's credible, it's decisive, there are metrics, it's measurable, and they are open to being publicly challenged on what they're doing. Clearly, there's not that many. I was trying to think, everyone's like, oh, which organization is level 4? I'm like, I'm not telling you because nobody's nailed it really, because the key word is authentic. So that's why I created this in this way, because rather than just saying what is, like what I see with all of the conversations that I've had, I'm also thinking about what does great look like, and this for me is what great looks like. So if anybody says to you, like, you know, what should we be aspiring to, you know, if we settle for level 3, all right then. But thinking about, again, the societal pressure here, I personally believe level 4 is where we should get to, because the other keyword here is accountability. So that's how we can ensure that organizations who committed in the summer of 2020 to do X, Y, and Z actually deliver, can actually talk about what they're measuring, can talk about the impact, not the intent. And it's not just about listing a group of traditional actions here. Do you know what I mean? So this is why this bit is important. So that's the summary of how it all fits together. So level 1 is where you're treating it as a compliance issue. It's in reaction to something. Level 2 is where there's an intent to be inclusive, but it's still very much driven by HR. A little bit of proactivity, but very generic conversation and talk about diversity and inclusion. Very little about racial equity, racism, Black colleagues, still very generic language there. Level 3 is when you're getting into strategic focus and specific commitment here. So the language is very intentional, very clear, very specific. There is internal communication here. It's led by the business or the board. You've got a senior person championing that. But the difference between level 3 and level 4, which is all about accountability. So there's public and private accountability here. And within all of this, an important aspect of this is that you also have leadership teams who are now owning the accountability piece and recognizing that some of their behaviors need to change. This is not about lower level organizations will be do as I say, not as I do, right? When you start getting up to level 3, level 4, it's about you need to hold us accountable for what we said and also how we lead that change. That's kind of the difference there. So with all of this, that was the maturity model, right? So that's something that, you know, anybody can take. And just the other thing to add here is one of the reasons why I spent so much time trying to create and then shape this is, even if nobody sees me, even if nobody engages with HR rewired, I wanted people to be able to take something away to be part of the solution, because as one person or as one company, we can't do everything. So the next bit is the race model. So the 4-factor race model was a way of me codifying all of the work that I had done with organizations, and then, you know, the team. So I have facilitators, I have coaches, you know, all sorts, and we've done different guises of work. But what was interesting is when I went back to have a look at every single thing that we've done, this is how this model came about. Very simply, you know, race model. I like to keep things simple. It's like my middle name. But this is, again, a framework that anybody can use. Do you know what I mean? And I will break down the steps, which very simply RACE. And the R stands for we need to recognize the problem. And within that, yes, I say, you know, we can't fix what we don't understand and we can't solve what we don't talk about. But depending on the level of introspection that your leadership teams are doing or you're doing in this space, right? Because there's always a role for the individual, dependent on the state of readiness of your organization. So how prepared are they to progress to those maturity levels that I talked about before? Do they even want to? Some organizations are quite happy to be compliance focused because they'll just deal with it if an issue comes up. They don't want to do anything more, nothing less. So that's the bit where you want to spend some time understanding what's the strategic imperative for change, you know, and so you're kind of getting into that, and I'll continue with that as we move on. A is analyze the impact. So that's about amplifying the voices of your Black colleagues so they feel seen and heard. C is about commitment to action. And this isn't just about listing a list of the traditional things, sponsorship, mentorship, all of the stuff that we've had under broader D&I. This is about choosing actions that are going to lead to impact and measuring them and being able to measure progress and measure the level of impact. And then E is empower for change, because this knowledge that you're getting under recognize the problem when you're talking about these things is that as an individual, as a board, as a HR team, as a DEI team, you cannot lead this change on your own. So you have to find ways to make it easy for your colleagues to lean in, easier for them to be part of the solution. But to do that, they need the skills, they need the infrastructure, and they need the support to be able to do that. So as I kind of touched on here, under this section, what you want to be thinking about is, am I clear how racism actually shows up in my workplace? For you to be able to answer that, you kind of got to know what racism is and what it isn't. So that's why I always say, like, the whether we get excited about allyship and, you know, all of the positive things that we think we can do, all of that means nothing. And more importantly, it can be construed as performative if there is not this understanding of what racism is. Now, this isn't about the, you know, the Encyclopedia Britannica, you know, and having to rattle it off, but there does need to at least be an understanding of the different types of racism. What does white supremacy mean? What does white privilege mean? What does white fragility mean? How does the role of leaders, how does your role in this and the introspection that's needed for you to show up, and how that has a knock-on effect? Because if you skip all of this introspection, this learning, you will perpetuate more harm and trauma for your Black colleagues. It's a given. And I think when you jump into action without understanding what racism is, even I say this to D&I people who kind of go, oh, I'm doing this. And I'm like, you know, like, you got to go back. You got to go back one step and just, you know, take some time. And then you're also going to want to think about, from a company perspective, where is the pressure coming from for you to address this? Because every company is going to have a very different pinch point. There's going to be different influencing factors. You know, for some, it's because they're trying to get into new markets, new international markets. For others, they're really honest and said it's because the investors are, you know, pressing the screws or whatever it is they're saying, right? So they're putting them under a lot of pressure. For others, it's their employees. For some of them, they're recognizing that actually they're starting to look a little bit rubbish, because where they thought this was going to pass, so they've stayed quiet and sat on the fence because everybody else is talking about it. They've got nothing to say, so they're frantically trying to catch up. But whatever the reason is, the more introspection, and I think the deeper you can take this, and this is where you've got to push past the discomfort with this, that has a direct correlation with how much sustainable change you're going to make. Because the more surface level that you keep this, because you think it's just a case of doing 1, 2, 3 things, being able to put it on your website that you've done that, you are not going to be able to sustain the momentum that is needed to make the true change. And that's by definition of the fact 400 years, 500 years later, we're still talking about racism because we never fixed it, you know? So that's why you've got to get into that level of introspection and the depth and the discomfort, and kind of, you know, almost sit and just accept it and then work through that. And as I said, dependent on where your maturity levels are, where you are on that level 1, 2, 3, 4, that is going to impact how much you want to show up in this space. And like, this part here is all about spending time with each other. So anybody who's involved in this, leading this, executing it, creating tools, thinking about what's my relationship with racism? Like, what do I think about all of this? What are my belief systems? What values do I have to question and hold a mirror up to? Because then you're also having to lead your peers, your colleagues. You might have to lead teams. So you're going to encourage them to do the same thing. So you kind of got to do it yourself as well. A is analyze the impact, right? So this is often something that's forgotten, if I'm really honest. And I'm focusing on organizations that have Black colleagues, because in the bid to be focused on the external view, they've actually forgotten that they have colleagues who are impacted by racism every single day. So part of this is a leadership role, right? So what authentic reflections have you shared? Whether that's you as the chief people officer, CEO, executive board member, chairperson, like whatever, what authentic reflections have you shared, and how have you used that to create a safe environment for your Black colleagues to say, actually, let me start talking about my lived experience. Be really honest about who you're speaking to. Like, I can tell you lots and lots of stories, but common themes that I see is, because of this discomfort in talking about race, leadership teams, HR teams, DEI teams are deliberately reaching out to who they feel are the unproblematic, in inverted commas, Black colleagues. So the ones who may tell them what they want to hear, the ones who may not be particularly challenging for their own personal reasons. And they use that as an opportunity to say, well, I spoke to so-and-so, you know, name one or two Black people in whatever layer. And, you know, they said, well, you know, they don't think that our culture is racist, or they don't think this and they don't think that, because you're just looking for somebody who's going to corroborate and make your life easier, rather than what are the real stories and the real experiences, right, in your company. Whose voices are you paying the most attention to? If you do not have senior individuals with both lived and professional experience, if you're relying on the chief people officer, your DEI lead, your chief diversity officer, you know, there's all sorts of interesting individuals outside of that who are leading this. If they don't have the lived experience, if they're white or of any other ethnicity, and you're paying attention to their voice, well, your question you should be asking is, where are they getting their intel from? What's informing their decisions about what your plan needs to look like and what actions you need to take? Because if you're not interrogating that, then, like I said, you are getting, it's easier, it's more risky, but you will be getting into performative territory, because you're reliant on people that don't have that understanding to come up with a plan. And if they've not done the introspection work from recognize the problem, then again, they are still perpetuating that, but also landing you in risky waters. Because there's going to be things that you think make sense because you're looking at it through your lens, that in the wider world doesn't translate. Use of language, you know, what's some of the initiatives that you're going after? People are looking at what you're doing differently, and that cannot be the same stuff that you've been doing for diversity and inclusion, because it's not worked. And I think the other thing to remember, diversity and inclusion as we know it now came from civil rights movement. It was about Black people being treated fairly in the workplace. And what many people forget is that that was hijacked for everybody else because of a discomfort, not only about race, but a real discomfort about prioritizing Black people. And what about this group? You know, what about women? What about, you know, and so everyone gravitated over there. And so the irony is that the very function that actually we shouldn't actually need to be talking about racial equity and anti-racism separately to DEI, because that was always what it was meant to be, but it's not how it's morphed into over the last 20 or so years, and 40 years, even if you take the complete time. So you've got to be aware of that and just make sure how much of what you're doing now is based on what I call pre-2020 knowledge. How much of it is based on traditional approaches to DEI? I'm not saying that you should throw them all out. What I'm saying is the issue that we're facing is racism and advancing racial equity, not belonging, not inclusion. This is real, deep, uncomfortable stuff. So you have to make sure that you're approaching it through that lens. So therefore, you have to understand the impact that that has. Therefore, you have to listen and amplify the voices of your Black colleagues. And then the other piece is, you then have to think about how you're inspiring the rest of your organization to lean into that, but also what are their stories and what are their experiences as bystanders? What stories do they have to tell about how they've seen some of their Black colleagues treated, or their perceptions, whether you agree with it or not? You know, this isn't about everyone coming together, come by our we shall overcome, because it's not that simple. But you want to create a dialogue, and you have to create a dialogue. Now, a question that I get asked all the time is, what if we don't have Black colleagues? So I say, right, if you don't have Black colleagues, next question to ask is, what about your clients? What about your customers? What about your supply chain? What about your partners? What about your subsidiary businesses? What about your parent company, right? What about the startup that you've acquired? That approach to help me understand how racism impacts you doesn't have to start and stop with your colleagues. It should actually go across the board. So if you don't, because you're in parts of the world where you don't have, you might have one or two or none, you can still apply this same principle. You're just broadening out who you're going to. Or you can go, we're going to use the same approach, but we're going to use our parent company this company, or, you know, whatever. So you can still do that. You've got to be a little bit more fleet of foot. You've got to be brave to start reaching out to people, but you can still do that. You know, this is still data. It's qualitative data, but it is still data, because it's stories, it's experience, it's lived experiences, you know, and this is what makes it real. The commit to action. So this is about, what does your quantitative and qualitative data tell you? Now, everyone always assumes that when I say like data, and they're going to go, oh, Shereen, I know what you're going to say, it's like because of racism. And I go, yeah, well, it could be. So the reason why there's a pattern in your data could well be, you know, racism, you know, your ethnicity pay gap, or promotion rates, or attrition rates. That's too simple to start and stop there. Here, what you want to engage is what I call, you know, we've heard this phrase before, like the 5 whys, root cause analysis. So you want to take a trend or a pattern that you see, and because I'm very visual, right, post-it note it if you must, and you keep asking, why does this appear? Why does this happen? Why? Do it 5 times. Because within that chain of answering the 5 whys, you'll start to understand how that problem is manifesting itself in your workplace. So what it means is it brings it into where you are, rather than this abstract thing that's happening, this generic thing that everyone thinks is happening across every single organization. But racism is going to manifest itself in very different ways, because you have slightly different systems and slightly different ways of doing things. So for every single trend, you want to just have a look at that, and then layer on top the qualitative data that you've got from analyze the impacts. You want to challenge yourself hard about what equitable initiatives you have in your plan. And what I mean by that is, what is fundamentally going to reduce the barriers that Black people face in your company, or that Black talent might face if they join, or clients who identify as Black, accessing your products, your services? How do you treat them? Not under the we treat everybody the same banner, but like, how do you acknowledge that maybe their experience of engaging with your product or service is going to differ because of the color of their skin? You've never thought about it because you've never asked the question. So you've got to think about, is this just about putting things on a list to be able to say we're doing it? Or are we thinking really hard about impact, and how do we measure that impact versus intent? Because if we're not careful, we get lollipops for ticking things off for doing it, but nobody ever thinks about, but to what level has this affected change? Do you know what I mean? And that's what the bit that I am most focused on. And through the things that I will start to do, so we haven't really done this yet. This is part of my deep insights work, that I trawl through all the stuff that I have. Yesterday, I announced via a fabulous press release in the UK and the US that I've partnered with Enzo Advisors. CEO is called Nidhi. She may or may not be on the call. I don't know if she's here today, but she specializes, and her company specializes in sustainability. And what they do is they marry kind of corporate strategy, financial forecasting into environmental, societal, and governance frameworks, so ESG frameworks, to be able for companies to be able to talk about how sustainable their business is, but also how they can measure impact and how they can measure what they're doing, so they can also communicate that externally to the market, investors, and all the like. So we've partnered together on this metrics piece, because it's massively important. And again, because I'm concerned about sustainable change, we've got to bring in everything we can to make sure that not only we're talking the language of business, but we're making it easy to understand how we're progressing. This is the bit that many companies fall down on, is the measurement. And the measurement is what is going to change your plan or your approach to this from being a charity cause to a strategic business imperative. That's the difference. It's all about the measurement. And the last bit is empower for change, right? So how are you upskilling your entire workforce? Challenge yourself to think about, is the things that we're doing is because it's what's comfortable, like we're just unwilling to do some stuff. And I can give you some great examples. So I often hear from companies who, you know, want to do workshops. They want to, you know, they want to commission me to create video content specifically to use for training purposes. And obviously, knowing me, right, I'm going to go, right, so you need to start with racism, you know, racism 101. I've got a video workshop called that, racism 101, and it's broken down, and we cover it all. They're like, yeah, we were interested in the allyship one. So I say, so what have you done to kind of understand about, you know, racism? They go, oh, well, you know, we've done unconscious bias training already. You know, we've had, you know, so-and-so come in. There's a reluctance to get into racism, they want to jump to the comfortable bit because everybody wants to be an ally. But you can't be an ally, not properly, if you don't understand what racism is. So every time when you're creating your own version of this, just challenge yourself and go, if this feels comfortable and palatable, it's probably not the right actions, if I'm really honest. It's just like the level of conversation. If you kind of feel all right, and everyone's like, yeah, you know, like agreeing and go, oh, yes, it's the right thing to do. And like, if people don't feel a bit pressed, if people don't feel a bit, you know, like, oh God, I need to just take a minute here, you probably haven't gone deep enough. And it's kind of the same with the actions that you have on your plan, but also how you allow your employees to be part of the solution, which means you've got to give them knowledge through choice rather than force, because I actually don't believe in compulsory, mandatory training, mandatory this, compulsory that. I just don't think it works, you know. And actually, it brings you back to compliance. It brings you to a level 1 organization if that's your approach, because that doesn't, you know, that doesn't equate to progress. It doesn't equate to impact. It doesn't equate to equality, actually. But personal opinion, so I'm open to be challenged on that. The safety net piece, the support infrastructure is really important, because we cannot expect our colleagues to magically become anti-racist, right, and know everything and say all the right things overnight just because we've done a few things. So just like a child who's learning how to ride a bike, our job is to help people get back in the saddle. Now, the scale of mistakes, there is a scale, just to be clear. So I'm not giving a pass for racism. That's not what I'm saying. But make it easy for people to do the right thing rather than putting all the interventions to catch them out when they're doing the wrong thing. So that's all I'll say on that one. And another important piece is that how can you help people move from being bystanders who feel disempowered, who accept certain things, certain outcomes, certain behaviours, certain approaches that have a disproportionate, unfair impact on their Black colleagues, or even other global majorities, I call them, not ethnic minorities, you know. So how do you help them move from, I'm just going to sit back because it doesn't impact me, to active allies? You know, one of the biggest issues that we have in dismantling racism, hate, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all of this awful stuff that we have is not actually the overt behavior. It's the fact that too many people stay quiet and apathy, and the silence, the inaction. They're not saying anything. They're not doing anything. The whispering in the corner after the fact is why we haven't been able to tackle this. So again, it's not just about sponsorship and mentorship things. All of those things are important to advance racial equity. But remember, I am also focused on anti-racism, and this is about what are you doing to consciously be part of the solution to dismantle racism? Because the danger is you can get caught up in all of the sexy stuff, you know. Racial equity, to be fair, as a phrase, is used because there's a lot of people who feel uncomfortable by having the word racism, anti-racist, or whatever else it is. Like they do mean two different things, but again, we're getting into comfort. So I've always got to remind people, don't forget, you know, anti-racism is the actions that you're doing to focus on dismantling racism. Advancing equity is about how you're removing barriers, creating opportunities, not from charity, but recognizing that things are unfair. Many HR departments struggle with equity versus equality because it's challenging inherent belief systems. And that's why I go back to, right, you know, when I was talking about R at the very beginning, recognize the problem. The need for introspection is really important because that's how you can unravel, you know, and think about your relationship with racism. That's why it's really important, particularly if you're the individual part of a team, you're leading a team, you're leading your company, right, to be part of the solution. You can't miss out that stage. So as we've seen it, so I've given you the racial equity maturity model, and you've seen the 4-factor race model. My wish for you all, is through adopting this lens, and I think it's all about being intentional. You know, this isn't about knee-jerk. This isn't about, let's just chuck some things on to-do list and hope it's and pray the best. This isn't just about wheeling in some poor consultant or some poor management consultant saying, can you fix it for us? But, you know, as I said, if you take these, because you'll never see me again, right? You'll never see HR Rewired. You'll never hear Shereen. I think it's kind of impossible. But let's imagine a world where you don't hear me. right, on video and, all the various things that I do. It's, taking this approach means that you will have increased knowledge and confidence. I promise you, because all of a sudden, everything you do is intentional, which means you're having these conversations and you're challenging yourself to say, are we sure that's not being performative? Like, genuinely, I know, like, in my own mind, if everybody adopted this sort of framework, we wouldn't get into black squares and hashtags and I stand with solidarity statements. I promise you, they wouldn't have done that because they would have so much other things that they know are going to make a difference. So that's where, but what, hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I've only created this now. So, what, we'll make a difference going forward. But the knowledge and confidence is really important. The clarity of purpose, because you're understanding what the imperative is for you to change. You're understanding why you need to change, even if this might not be the societal why, the moral why. There is a business imperative to this. We can't get away from it. But how I choose to bring in the business imperative isn't by making the case for eradicating racism. I am not interested in the pound, shillings and pence argument per se, that basically says, treat your employees and your diverse employees, in inverted commas, as ways to make more money, because that's no different than how we were treated on the plantation field. So I don't get into all of that. What I do talk about is the fact that there is a expectation for change. So you've got to be able to talk about how you're doing it. So there's got to be a strategic imperative there. How are you measuring it? How do you know impact? That's the bit that I choose. Not everybody does that, and that's fine. That's for them. But that's not how I operate. That's not how we operate within HR Rewired. And lastly, it is about meaningful action, because it is going to take the deep stuff. And there's many, many things that you can do. Like somebody said to me, like, oh, we've got 4 things, like we've run out of stuff to do. Listen, we've got a massive list, proprietary list of about 50 odd things that you can do. But we never just go out and say, here it is, because it's all in context to your organization, where you are, what you stand for, where you're trying to get to, the level you're trying to get to, what the strategic imperative is, the tighter you can nail this, make it become part of your values. This is the thing that people overlook. Make this be part of your values, because then it's a lot easier to weave it into everything. It's when you keep it as like a separate something that you've got to do because the world is looking, that's when you're going to get into problems, because you're going to run out of steam to make meaningful action, So as we come to the end, we're almost here. I've got no idea of what time it is. How long have I been talking? Oh, goodness, look at that, 7 minutes. But I'll still be around. So we've got to remember it's a source of value creation, right? So this is the irony, it's not lost on me, but just hold on for a minute. So the UK Investment Authority is now applying pressure to FTSE 350 companies and giving them amber top ratings, which basically means, like got red, amber, green. So amber at the top of the amber. So you're almost heading into red, but they're not quite going to put you in there. And what they're saying is that you've got to have a credible and decisive plan about what you're doing about ethnic minority representation on boards and climate change response. So this is just societal pressure morphing into institutional pressure, morphing into investor pressure. Now, fabulous dental Andrew was like, yes, because the boards have to represent, modern day Britain. And then here we have his board, which I did think was funny. But again, if you're not intentional and you don't think this through, because they're trying to make sure they're not on the back foot because everybody else is coming. That's what you get. So remember, I was talking about the website look. That's what happens. I just want to remind people, because I do get asked this question a lot. I think people think I just make videos all day, which is fun, and do lives, play music, play reggae music all day like I don't do anything else. So this is in essence what we do, right? So we've got executive briefings, talks, keynotes, anything to unlock and ensure that people recognise the issue, right? We do listening forums to amplify Black colleagues, to, or Black people in the community, right? If you're an organisation that's trying to get closer, that's what we do. The Equity Development Lab that we do, a 30-day programme where we promise people that they will walk out with a credible and decisive racial equity plan. So no more than 10 people, and it's 4 3.5 sessions per week over 4 weeks. Nidhi's an instructor, I'm an instructor. We've got some instructors from all over the world, and we take them through various aspects of their plan so they can go back with a plan that has not a hint of performatism or tokenism in sight, which is great. Nidhi, as I said, and her team do part of the DEI impact assessment and communication to investors and and key stakeholders so they can get involved in all of that. And then the knowledge hub is infrastructure, so whether that's coaching support, like a help desk style approach, licensing some of my content, or I'm asked to create bespoke content for organizations. So that's all about empowering the entire workforce and giving access to knowledge. And so the three things that I want to just mention here about how we do what we do as a company is we're driven by three very strong guiding principles, right? So the first thing is we're here to inform. And that need to inform is why there is so much content that I produce, that I've got writers, I've got, graphic designers, they do all of this stuff. All of that is about making sure that we can say we're being part of the solution, even if we're not paid to do so, right? That's really, really important to me. It's a personal thing. It's how I got into this, so that's really important. We have a respect. Now, everyone thinks this means respect for individuals, which is a bit like, oh yeah, I respect this person. Clearly I do. But the respect here is about respecting the seriousness of the issue of racism. Because I respect it so much, what it means is I will not water down for comfort, for sake of getting a client, for onboarding a client, the issue of racism, because I'm respectful of the seriousness of it. I'm respectful of people who've come before me. I'm respectful of enslaved people. I'm respectful of people who are not in organizations that are doing anything. So my job and our job collectively within HR Rewired is to make sure there's enough focus, and there's the real focus, because we want to just make sure that every day we can look in the mirror and make sure we're part of the solution, and we're not perpetuating through our silence, through our watering down and all of that good stuff. So that's really important. And ultimately we just want to inspire, that's why I create another iteration. I've got hundreds, I can say now, videos and content, that sort of thing. This is another iteration with the framework. We've got more things happening. We also have very exciting, because I've been working on this for like months with a team quietly, we've been working away. So we have an equity and inclusion test, and it's a morphing, all of the stuff I talked about from the 4 levels of a maturity model. And it's just helping particularly smaller companies, right? So if you've already done something, but you're not sure that you're starting off in the right place, or you're just about to start, it's just a way of analyzing very quickly, just giving you a quick snapshot, but you get personalized results based on your answer. So these are the 3 areas that we look at: your people, its culture, and the organization. And how you answer that, we will give you some advice. We will point you to specific references or resources, not always mine, and we'll give you some pointers of what you might want to think about and where you should start. So we're trying to take what feels very abstract and give very specific advice here. And it's free, which is even better, because I know we all like freeness. I am conscious of the time, so I have been dead on an hour. However, I am going to stick around. So if anybody's got any questions, I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to stop recording. And then, I'm here, so you can either give me some feedback, ask me some questions about applications, anything. Like I'll hang around. And if nobody wants to talk to me, that's fine. At that point, I will go. So thank you all, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you for listening. Just thank you for trying to be part of the solution. It's going to take so many of us. So I'm always appreciative when people turn up.
Thanks, Shereen. That's great.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks, Shereen. Babs here. I really, really appreciate